And Onselin joins Luke every Saturday morning. He's the Chief Economist at NB Fund and NB Super. He talks about a whole lot of range of issues in terms of the economy. Usually it's variations on a theme. Leith, good morning to you once again.
G'day, John. How are you?
Not too bad. Now, these figures we get from the Bureau of Statistics, they come out on a regular basis. You go through these figures, you pull them together for us. So sometimes tell us what we already know, that construction rates are in real trouble.
Yeah, that's right, John. This week, the Australian Bureau of Statistics released its quarterly data on dwelling commencements and completions, and surprise, surprise, they've collapsed to around 1/3 below the Albanese government's target, which listeners might recall. The Albanese government announced that it wants to build 1.2 million homes over 5 years, which requires 240,000 homes to be built every year. And sadly, only 172,000 dwellings were completed in the year to March, which is about 78,000 below Labor's 240,000 construction target. But to make matters worse, John, the forward-looking indicators were even worse. So only 159,000 dwellings were commenced in the year to March. So those are the ones that have just started construction. That's about 81,000 below Labor's annual target. And the latest dwelling approvals data, which is released separately monthly, that shows that only 164,000 homes have been approved for construction in the year to May, which is 76,000 below the Albanese government's 240,000 target. So effectively, we've got a record gap that has emerged between population demand through immigration and housing supply, which means that the rental crisis is just going to keep continuing. And just to add one last thing, I've been banging on every week about this energy crisis that Australia has, whereby we're paying some of the highest gas and electricity prices in the world because we're not reserving our gas for domestic use. Well, Brickworks a month or so ago warned that Australia's high gas prices were making it uneconomic to build bricks. And bricks is obviously a key input into Australia's housing construction. So the federal government's failure to basically address the gas crisis in the energy market are directly working against its housing targets by making new supply too expensive.
Yeah.
And it's making, obviously pushing up construction costs, and it's making building unprofitable. So the bottom line is that this 1.2 million target just looks like it doesn't have a snowflake's chance in hell of being met.
Yeah.
And the only real solution is for the federal government to dramatically cut back on population growth via immigration. Otherwise, the housing shortage is just going to keep getting worse.
I want to get to that in a moment. Just on the question of gas, because we've had this situation with gas where this has been building for a long time, and you've got the gas reservation policy in WA, but now we've got huge amounts of gas. We're extracting it and we're selling it at a good price to customers in other parts of the world, and now we're building terminals, aren't we, so that we can get some of the gas that we've exported shipped back here and purchased by us to use here.
It is the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen. It's akin to, Kuwait or Saudi Arabia or Iran or any of those oil exporting nations basically engineering a domestic shortage of oil, paying $2 a litre at the pump for petrol, and then telling their citizens, we don't have enough because we're selling all overseas, so therefore we're going to build import terminals so we can import our own oil at world prices. That's effectively what Australia has done with our gas. We export just over 70% of our gas on the East Coast. Yep. The majority of it goes to China and Japan. China and Japan are getting so much of our gas, they've got more than they need, and they're actually reselling a lot of that gas on the global market for profit.
And we're
at the same time as... Mate, and then it's insane. So they're reselling it for a profit, and then we could potentially be buying back that gas instead of just reserving it for domestic use.
Yep.
And just one last thing I need to add to this: the United States now is the biggest gas exporter in the world. They overtook us a year or so ago. The Americans pay $2.50 a gigajoule US for their gas, which is about $4 Australian. Us on the East Coast, we're paying minimum $12 and up to $25 a gigajoule. So we pay 3 to 6 times as much as Americans pay.
Yep.
And the reason for the difference is America has a reservation policy whereby they basically say you've got to supply Americans first.
Yep.
And they have a regulated price, so cost plus pricing, which is standard utilities regulation. As a result, Americans pay cheap prices. They've got a competitive manufacturing sector. We don't have any of that stuff, and we have incredibly high gas prices. We have manufacturers going down, going under left, right and centre, including Brickworks. And we've got a cost of living crisis and an inflation crisis. It's just, you cannot mess things up worse than what Australia's done.
And I was reading about this. So if you look at it, for instance, I think the coal seam gas fields in Queensland, the companies involved there overstated what they were going to get out of there.
Yep.
And then you had of course, we know what's happened with Narrabri. We've been talking about that for year after year after year. And then you've got the huge reserves in Victoria where that's been locked up.
Yeah, it's crazy. And then at the same time, for until a few years ago, we were actually exporting Bastrate gas. So that's the gas that's diminishing in Victoria, which has supplied the East Coast for decades. And we were, because they had more contracts to sell it overseas than we had domestic supply in those fields, they were actually extracting gas from down south. So, the whole thing just couldn't be, you could not mess it up worse. Basically build 6 export trains to liquefy our gas, to send it off to China and Japan, etc. We built more, we signed more contracts than we had gas for, and then as a result, we've created a domestic shortage.
Yep.
And it's just stupid. And the Labor government that was in, the Rudd-Gillard government, didn't reserve gas for domestic use when they built these terminals. We became the only exporting region in the world that doesn't have a reservation policy. And as a result, we despite the fact we export over 70% of it, we've got a domestic shortage and we're paying ridiculously high prices. You just cannot make it up.
Yeah, it's incredible. And just on migration, which I know you talk about a lot, and these figures come out every month, and it is a bit like trying to turn around a large ship, isn't it? You've got to try and turn the tap off. And so you've got people coming, the numbers coming in May remain strong, and it just, the way this works, number one, it's very hard to turn the tap off, and number two, doesn't seem to be too much communication within the department, all the different streams of people coming in, and keep a handle on how many are coming in.
No, so we had record net overseas migration last year, about 550,000. We had about 650,000 overall population growth, and basically the Albanese government in their May budget, which was only a couple of months ago, said that net overseas migration would fall to 395,000 last financial year. So that's the one just gone. And instead, the monthly net permanent long-term arrivals data, which very closely tracks the official net overseas migration data, it's released way more frequently. We got the first 5 months of May data out. And Australia received 243,000 net permanent long-term arrivals in the first 5 months of this year, which is about 35,000 more than we received in the same time last year, which was obviously a record year, and about 91,000 more than we received in 2019, which was the year before the pandemic started. So what it basically tells you is that net overseas migration is going to smash the Albanese government's targets, which it made just in May, and we're probably going to have about 500,000 for last financial year. So it is coming down slightly, but it's still at this extreme level. And the problem with it is it's obviously coming in at the same time as dwelling construction rates are falling, which is driving the rental crisis. So, it's just a policy disaster, and it's another reason why I've got high inflation. It's not just energy. We've also got, obviously, rampant rental inflation and overall housing inflation. And the high immigration is helping to push up that, which is helping to push up overall inflation.
Because one of the arguments that was being, I think the Australian was writing about this week, where, for instance, if you do a dramatic cut in immigration, now, it doesn't mean this, because they're talking about things like doctors and teachers, where we need those people we need people because half our doctors are coming from overseas, and that if we cut this, we're going to affect the situation in terms of being able to get to a doctor and a GP. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're the ones that get cut, does it?
No, of course not. I mean, 550,000 net overseas migration, very tiny percentage of that is very high skilled people like doctors. So, we just want a much smaller migration program that is incredibly highly skilled and imports people that we genuinely need. The problem with it is the overwhelming majority of Australia's migration, despite what the government says, is not skilled, it's unskilled. And as a result, we have a shortage of highly skilled people in the country, and that was confirmed by jobs and skills data that was released this month. We actually have a bigger shortage of highly skilled workers than we had before the pandemic, despite the fact we've imported 1 million people in 2 years. Yet we have a massive oversupply of lower skilled people. And that's all because of immigration. So we've been importing a lot of lower skilled people. We haven't been importing a lot of higher skilled people. I think we should get the numbers down, but make it very highly skilled. That's the solution to this. And then you take the pressure off housing and all the other things. You also collect more tax revenue because highly skilled people pay more tax. They tend to be more productive. So you have higher productivity in the economy. It's not rocket science here. You want to You want a quality-based system, not a quantity-based system. And unfortunately, we have a quantity-based system at the moment.
Just on the gas one, and Russell asked this question, and I know these are all contracts that have been done. He says, why can't the gas policy be altered? Well, they have tried in terms of some areas there, but there are contracts, aren't there? So the way to alter is you try and tap into the sources we've got, don't you? Try and extract more.
Yes, but you can also cancel the contracts. The contracts have got force majeure in them, which basically means that if the government changes policy, you can declare the contracts null and void. So, and the whole fact of it, my issue with that whole thing is, we can't cancel the contracts, is that the gas companies, private companies made these contracts when they didn't have the gas, right? They didn't think about us when they made the contracts. And secondly, China has cancelled a whole bunch of contracts for us in a whole bunch of areas, right? They've ripped us off in a whole bunch of areas, wine, lobsters, a whole bunch of things.
Yep.
They didn't have any problems cancelling those contracts. So why can't we hit them back? If we're exporting more gas than China needs, why not just cut back on some of those contracts?
Yep. Well,
declare force majeure, cut them off, keep it for domestic use, and then regulate the price using old-fashioned cost-plus pricing, which has been used for utilities for generations. So that means that if it costs $4 a gigajoule to pull it out of the ground, they're allowed to charge $5. They get a 25% markup.
Yep.
So they make 25% profit. That is what we've used for utilities regulation forever, for decades, generations across not just in Australia but the world. That is what you do. That's what America does. That's why America's got cheap gas and cheap energy. And if you have cheap gas, you get cheap electricity, because gas is the marginal price setter for electricity, because it's used as firming power. So every time you don't have enough renewables or coal, whatever, you've got to use gas, because gas can be turned on and off in an instant.
Of course, yep.
And when you make that expensive, you make electricity expensive.
Of course. 25 minutes past 11, and we know that the growing cost of the NDIS, and there's huge numbers of people that have benefited enormously from the NDIS, but the cost of it's just grown like topsy. There are constant stories about people who are getting extraordinary things being, obviously businesses that are trying to rip people off. There's a whole range. I mean, we know the story with the NDIS, but you've had a look at this in terms of the NDIS and the impact it's having on the job market.
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary. So the NDIS currently costs over $40 billion a year. Within 10 years, the Parliamentary Budget Office projected it's going to cost about $100 billion, so about the same as the age pension. So we're talking about enormous money here. And interestingly, the Australian Bureau of Statistics released some data to the March quarter, so this is quarterly data, and it showed that the private sector, or it's called the market sector, that's basically everything that's not government aligned, actually had almost zero jobs growth in the year to March. So we only had 6,000 jobs in the private sector. That's on a population increase of about 650,000. Mm. And all of Australia's jobs growth actually came from government-aligned jobs, and most of that was related to the NDIS. So, for example, healthcare and social assistance, we had 218,000 jobs created over the year, which was the overwhelming majority. And also the number of hours worked in the private sector in the year to March actually fell, whereas it rose across all these government-aligned areas, and most of that's related to the NDIS. So the reason why Australia's unemployment rate remains low at 4.1% is really because of this NDIS jobs. And the private sector, by contrast, has got basically zero jobs growth and has actually shed hours in the last year. So I don't think that's a particularly sustainable situation we've got. And it does show that Australia's low unemployment rate's a little bit artificial, and it's basically been propped up by government spending in the NDIS.
All right, as always, very interesting. Leith Van Onselen, each week you spell all this out. Let's see if any of it is addressed by the time we talk again. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, John. Speak to you next time.
Leith Van Onselen there, and he's here every Saturday morning talking about these issues at around about this time.